Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome everyone to this fireside chat with Beth von Schaack, the Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice. I'm Professor Laura Dickinson here at GW Law School. I'm also the co-faculty director of the program in National Security, Cybersecurity, and Foreign Relations Law. And it's really my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Ambassador von Schaack. And just briefly, I'll say that Ambassador von Schaack is really the perfect person for this role at this time in history. She has extensive experience and really was a world-renowned expert in global criminal justice before she assumed this role. She's a graduate of Stanford University and Yale Law School, and she has a PhD as well from Leiden University. And she's served as a law professor at Santa Clara University School of Law, as well as Stanford Law School. She has authored numerous influential articles and more. And she also has extensive practical experience, including having served as the Deputy Ambassador at Large, the Deputy Ambassador for Global Criminal Justice in the Obama administration. I also want to note that her confirmation is historic because she is the first woman to be confirmed in this position. So she will speak to us today about the Biden administration approach to international criminal justice. And I'll begin by engaging in a dialogue with Ambassador von Schaack, and then we'll have time to open it up for questions from the assembled group. So just to kick things off, Beth, can you tell us a little bit about what your role is and what are your responsibilities? What do you do on a day-to-day basis in this job?
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for setting this up and for all my colleagues who may have heard some of this before in the past. I also want to acknowledge that ambassadors at large 1, 2, 3, and 5 are in the room. So I'm really honored. Laura and I recently saw the musical 6. And so I don't know if you know the sort of beheaded, divorced, whatever, but I survive. Some of y'all not so well, but number 6 gets off well. So anyway, it's great to be here. Thank you. So the Office of, I'm a big musical theater fan. The Office of Global Criminal Justice has its origins when Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State, and she wanted there to be a point office within the building reporting directly to her that would be the point of contact with the 2 ad hoc criminal tribunals that were being then stood up, one for the former Yugoslavia, and then a year later, the Security Council again acted and created the Rwanda Tribunal. Over the years, our mandate has expanded to include a whole range of transitional justice situations, so not just international tribunals, but where there are domestic pathways to justice, including thinking about how do we support commissions of inquiry, truth commissions that might be stood up, cases under extraterritorial principles of jurisdiction happening in Europe, arising out of Syria, for example. So we're sort of a diplomatic arm in many respects, supporting those efforts and then working within the interagency. So we advise State Department leadership, but also across the interagency, and then work very closely with Congress as well on issues around the prevention of and response to atrocities.
So building off of that, you know, the just horrific atrocities in Ukraine are perhaps top of mind for many people in this room and for people around the world. But there's a lot that your office is doing outside of Ukraine. Could you say a little bit about the 3 most important areas that you're working on outside of the Ukraine context?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because this was an enormous job before February 24th when Russia relaunched a full-scale invasion against Ukraine. We have a jurisdiction essentially over the entire world. We're not like a regional office. We are a functional office, and I am the ambassador at large for global criminal justice. And I do want to take those terms very seriously. So very early in my tenure, I made 2 trips to Africa. First to the Central African Republic and Ethiopia, and then to the Gambia and Liberia. And the goal there was to help conceptualize how the US, working with the international community, could advance international justice processes that were either stalled, underway, or imagined. And in Ethiopia, I was there at a time when there was a ceasefire in place. This was prior to the cessation of hostilities agreement. So the conversation had shifted to what a inclusive, credible, comprehensive transitional justice process might look like. And so we were there in a kind of technical capacity. In the Central African Republic, we have supported financially through congressional earmarks the special criminal court that's there, which is a really unique hybrid model. There's now cases proceeding on 3 levels with respect to the Central African Republic, in national courts, in this hybrid court, and then also at the International Criminal Court. There were some cooperation issues happening between the Special Criminal Court and the ICC. That was one of the issues that I wanted to address as ambassador. I think we've worked through those, which is great. And now the ICC has announced that because the Special Criminal Court is operational, it is not envisioning additional indictments in the Central African Republic situation. So focusing on the Gambia and Liberia, both of them are at very similar places, although sort of 10 years separated, where they had terrible conflict situation, sequential civil wars in Liberia, and a very repressive regime in the Gambia, a very strong Truth Commission process that generated credible recommendations, very few of which have been implemented. And so there the idea was sort of what can be done to urge a process forward? How can we empower civil society actors? How can we offer technical support? What more can the international community be doing? So those are important situations we're focused on. The situation in Myanmar is also terrible. I mean, it's still, I think, an ongoing genocide. We have made a genocide determination there, and we're still seeing very terrible persecution against Rohingya populations, but also other ethnic minorities, political opposition, et cetera, since the coup now, which just had an anniversary behind us. There, we're focusing on supporting a whole range of pathways to justice, even though it's foreclosed within Myanmar itself. Of course, the ICC has seized jurisdiction. There's a case before the International Court of Justice brought by the Gambia. So when I met senior leadership in the Gambia, I was able to praise them, the president himself, to say, this is amazing that you have stepped up, and on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and peace-loving, rule of law states around the world, brought suit against Myanmar under the Genocide Convention before the ICJ in a completely different region of the world. And then we also have some universal jurisdiction cases happening. Germany has just announced a new one, working with an NGO, Fortified Rights, that has filed a case, and the hope is that the prosecutor will pick that up. And then I was able to travel to Buenos Aires to meet with prosecutors and judges down there who have also are entertaining an extraterritorial case involving events in Myanmar. And part of what our office will be doing is trying to facilitate the travel of the complainants who are now in a refugee camp in Cox's Bazar, no papers, never stepped foot on a plane before, down to Buenos Aires to give live testimony, which is what the judge prefers there, and then get them safely back to Cox's Bazar. So I'll be leaving Friday for Bangladesh for that purpose. So lots of other areas of the world that we're very focused on.
Wow, that's quite a list, and that's only just a few.
Right.
Do you see the Ukraine situation, which is really at the forefront of global discussions, diverting resources away from these types of other situations where there are massive atrocities occurring?
There definitely is some anecdotal evidence of that, of just attention shifting. Even at the recent Assemblies of States Parties meeting, the Bangladesh representative said to someone who then relayed to me that there was not a single mention of that case. And here we were at the ASP, which was supposed to be about how do we strengthen the court, how do states who are members of the court recommit to cooperation, how can non-party states also cooperate and assist the work of the court. And this momentous case was barely mentioned. And there was lots then, in comparison, of discussion about the situation of Ukraine, including the potential aggression tribunal. So the worry about distraction is there. I think the flip side of that is we have never seen the international community more united around the imperative of justice in a long time. I mean, certainly post-World War II period, we had that kind of moment of consensus where the majority of the globe came together. And then I think again in the mid-90s, when the 2 ad hoc tribunals were created by the Security Council, you again saw that sort of recognition that the world could not stand by. These crimes must not go unpunished, and the world had to have a consensus response. And so we're seeing that again. And so my hope is it's a sort of a tide, the tide raises all boats, that the fact that we're on record now as recognizing the imperative of accountability and the need to invest in full-scale, broad, and comprehensive accountability will then be able to redound to the benefit of other situations that cry out for justice. But I'm very mindful of reports and accounts and grumbling about selective justice, and this is just a European endeavor, all of that. And we need to engage much more with states and other regions that have themselves experienced abuses or are maybe still experiencing abuses, and hear them and bring them into a system of international justice so it's responsive to their needs.
That's really interesting. So there's the potential there for global interest in accountability for atrocities in Ukraine to catalyze other initiatives. Yep. Let's talk a little bit about Syria. What are the ongoing issues and challenges there?
Yeah, so Syria is one of the tough cases of international justice, as if they're not all tough cases of international justice. Many of you will remember in 2014, there was an effort to refer the matter to the International Criminal Court. Russia, with China in tow, exercised a double veto there, so that did not move forward. It's precisely the kind of situation that the ICC was designed to tackle. Broad, massive abuses, no domestic accountability whatsoever, a very repressive regime, millions of people displaced and harmed. And that, the referral wasn't able to be done because Russia, of course, was protecting its client state. And so lots of proposals were floated about other alternatives to create some sort of an international tribunal, and none of them had the political will to move forward. So what we have seen now is domestic courts stepping up as engines of accountability, and very interesting public-private partnerships between civil society organizations, survivor organizations, doing some of the functions that ordinarily it would be law enforcement doing. They would be gathering evidence, analyzing that evidence, creating refined reports of chains of command, et cetera, or a debrief on a particular incident, working with witnesses and survivors to determine who is prepared to give testimony, and then accompanying them as they give that testimony in a legal process. This has been facilitated by legal frameworks within mostly European states, but not exclusively, that allow for the exercise of extraterritorial jurisdiction, of jurisdiction over events that happened outside their territories, when the only nexus may be the presence of an accused or the presence of witnesses and survivors, complainants who can give testimony. And so we've seen across Europe, Germany very much in the lead, a number of cases against actors from the Syrian and in many respects the Iraq and their overlapping conflicts being brought to justice because they've sought safe haven in these European states, including high-level Assad figures. So that's very much a new frontier of justice, domestic courts stepping up, playing their part, enforcing international law, using their own domestic courts. And it's been shown that it can be done. These are tough cases, they're expensive. Evidence is maybe distributed across the globe. Defendants can be very powerful. There are witness intimidation issues, and yet we've been able to achieve fair proceedings that have resulted in the conviction of individuals accused of extremely serious crimes.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Let's move back to Africa. You mentioned Central African Republic and your trips to Africa. Looking at the continent as a whole, what do you think are some of the top global criminal justice issues facing the continent, and what's the U.S. position towards those?
Yeah, I've mentioned a couple of them. I mean, you'll remember about a decade ago, there was a bit of a retrenchment. I mean, Africa, the African states were very early adopters of the ICC. They were part of the like-minded group at Rome. They wanted a strong and independent court. They wanted a court that could help them deal with abuses happening in their systems that they were overwhelmed by. Then, many of the cases proceeded against African defendants, including then eventually high-level senior figures, including heads of state. And that caused a bit of a backlash across the continent. Not across the board. It was certain states were very much driving that. It was happening at political levels within the African Union. Many other states remained strong supporters and were contrary voices to those impulses to sort of that Africa should pull back, that the court was targeting Africa, et cetera. It was often forgotten that most of the cases that were before the court were there because the African states themselves had referred the matter. This was not a third state referral or a Security Council referral. This was the DRC, et cetera, saying, we can't handle this, we need help. And the ICC was seen as a credible and important partner to be able to tackle some of the impunity challenges that they were facing. So now what we're seeing is states like the Gambia and Liberia that have had a somewhat of a transitional justice process. How do you then move to the next step and ensure some measure of accountability? Ethiopia is in the same place. The Cessation of Hostilities Agreement contains explicit language that there will be a transitional justice process that will involve accountability. Now we have to think about what does that look like? And that will be an exercise for Ethiopian civil society, for progressive thinkers there, for the government, but then also international partners to help shape. And our office is trying to and hoping to tee up a conversation where activists, policymakers, lawyers from Colombia and Kenya and South Africa, Cambodia, places where they've had a process, they have lessons learned, there are object lessons plus positive lessons, to come and share and speak with their Ethiopian counterparts to say, this is how we did it, I would avoid this, try this, it worked for us, it may not work for you, so that Ethiopia can develop its own bespoke approach. So that to me is sort of African solutions to African problems, but with the support and assistance of the international community, recognizing that there are voices there that want to see this work be done and done in a way that's credible but also fair.
It sounds like your office and the administration is really engaged across Africa and across all of these conflicts and atrocity situations. On the bringing a lessons learned conference together and helping local communities with that, I just want to note that when I was at the State Department many years ago, we did that for East Timor.
Right.
And it was very, very helpful, I think. Let's turn now to Ukraine. Can you say a little bit about the myriad efforts that the U.S. is engaging there to pursue accountability for these massive, massive atrocities that are ongoing? I mean, it seems as if Russia is just taking the list of war crimes and going through them one by one.
Yeah, no, it's a horrible situation. I mean, U.S. policy toward Ukraine has three primary pillars. Number one, strengthen Ukraine's hand on the battlefield. And of course, we're doing that to enormous degrees. Number two is the humanitarian crisis and being, acutely responsive to that. And number three is accountability. That is the third pillar of this administration's Ukraine policy. And I had Secretary Blinken look at me in the eye and say, Beth, we're counting on you. And you're like, gulp. I mean, it was like day, 10 or something. And it was like, boy, shit just got real. Shit just got real in this job. So we are doing a lot. Our office historically did not have programming money. Over the years, Congress has seen fit to empower us to do some direct programming in this space, and that's been really welcome, because before we had to sort of go out hat in hand to other bureaus and offices that had programming money and try and convince them that our little priorities kind of fit and jived and resonated with their priorities. Now we have some money to work with, and with some of the new supplementals, we've been given $15 million to focus on accountability. So 10 of that has gone to a project we're calling the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group. It started with actually one of my predecessors, Clint Williamson, who's here, basically doing capacity building with the Prosecutor General arising out of the 2014 attacks, thinking about how to do war crimes cases with crimes that happened in Crimea and in the eastern regions. That project has now been scaled significantly. Clint has transferred to Georgetown. Georgetown is the lead implementing agency. The EU and the United Kingdom have now joined, and it's meant to be a combination of a sort of coordination mechanism to ensure we're not over or under investing in different accountability lines of effort, but also ensuring that the Prosecutor General has the strategic advice that he needs and that his team needs to be able to do these cases effectively, but also fairly. So one of the big initiatives that Georgetown took on, which I thought was incredibly, brilliant, was to take Ukrainian prosecutors to Bosnia and Croatia to talk to their counterparts. You had war on your soil. You had terrible war crimes being committed. How did you deal with this? How did you deal with issues of witness protection? How did you empower survivors? How did you deal with resistance within your Ministry of Defense to having too aggressive an accountability program? How did all of those obstacles get overcome, and what lessons can we learn now that we're facing this terrible challenge in our own system? And so that's one of our big projects. We're also looking to capacitate what we're calling strategic litigation. So litigation that would be happening not at the ICC and not in domestic courts in Ukraine, but potentially in third courts, in other international courts. Ukraine has been quite brilliant in utilizing lawfare. I know that's somewhat of an objectionable term, but it is part of any conflict these days. There will be a legal dimension to it. So they have sought jurisdiction in any court that would be able to offer it. The European Court of Human Rights, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, of course, is engaged. The Law of the Sea Tribunal is engaged, all trying to cabin and bring attention to the breaches of international law being committed, as you said, on a daily basis by Russia.
So it's really a very multi-layered approach and multidimensional. There are many countries involved, and there are many fora and tribunals involved. Can you say a little bit about the coordination challenges?
Yeah, they're huge. I often get asked by journalists, it sounds chaotic, it sounds chaotic. And I always say, it's not chaotic, it's decentralized. That's my alternative word. It's very decentralized. It is happening across multiple fora. There are many different actors. And so, there's only so much one can coordinate these actors, right? They're all motivated by their own agendas, their resources, what access they have, who their clients are, et cetera. But the point is, I think, and this is what the Ukrainians have said often, is they want to see comprehensive accountability. And so wherever jurisdiction exists, if there is a defendant or a respondent within reach, then that court should be activated if there's subject matter jurisdiction that exists. And so enabling that to happen. Now, what we're starting to create as a sort of meta level is these coordination mechanisms. So there's now a massive joint investigative team, which is mostly regional states, but then some Europeans and the US are sort of partners or cooperating elements to that. That will facilitate the sharing of information around Europe. So even with mutual legal assistance treaty arrangements, which help, there's still a lot of friction in the system. There's still a sort of diplomatic component. It's got to go to the authority locally, then up, and then down to the judge, and then back again. Within a JIT, the prosecutors can just speak directly with each other. They can create a shared database or an evidence vault, and the Eurojust network is doing that now for Ukraine. And so these are models that I think will then be able to be applied elsewhere. We're also seeing regular meetings happening. The Dutch convened a Ukraine Accountability Conference. The Brits are now doing a follow-up 2.0 in March, in part to have all the states come together and say, this is what we're doing, this is where we're investing, this is how we're helping the ICC, this is what we're doing in our domestic system. So they can all sort of compare notes, identify gaps, and then work to fill those gaps.
Speaking of the multiplicity of tribunals, what are your thoughts about the efforts to create a tribunal to try the crime of aggression in Ukraine?
Indeed, this is a very high priority for the Ukrainians. The Prosecutor General is here in Washington this week. They did an event at Georgetown, and this was one of his top his lines of effort that he's focusing very strongly on. There are a number of different models that have been proposed, and so it's a really interesting exercise. Like as I step back in my academic role, it's such an interesting exercise of institutional design. So do you create this could be done in domestic courts in Ukraine. They have a provision that sort of allows for what you could envision as a prosecution for the crime of aggression. It's not defined in the same way as the ICC statute, Article 8 bis, but it's there, and they've done a few cases. So purely domestic. On the other end of the spectrum, what the Ukrainians were originally asking for, although I think they've realized that that may be a bridge too far, would be a General Assembly resolution whereby the Secretary General would be asked to stand up through the UN auspices some sort of an international tribunal. And then in the middle, you have all sorts of interesting hybrid models that one could envision. And that's where we seem to be coalescing, I think, if I'm channeling discussions in Europe accurately. The Dutch have now come forward with a really interesting proposal, which is to create an interim prosecutor's office. I think that name is probably going to change, although the names that are being considered are like 15 words, and so that's kind of handy to just say, just do an IPO. And the idea there would be a little bit similar to the Kosovo tribunal, and we have Alex Whiting here in the room, who's the acting prosecutor there, where there was this investigative team first established under sort of EU auspices as part of the global administration of this new territory of Kosovo, to start gathering evidence, figuring out who the defendants might be, what are the key emblematic incidents that any accountability exercise would want to focus on, and prepping up sort of notional indictments for when there is a jurisdiction that can then operate. And so this is what the Dutch have proposed with respect to the crime of aggression. Bring together Ukrainian prosecutors, maybe secondees that could come from other systems, to gather evidence of acts of aggression, which frankly is sort of the easy part of it. It's so blatant and such a manifest violation of the UN Charter that that's not the hard part. The hard part is with aggression as a leadership crime, who beyond the top three, which are maybe obvious, would we want to be focusing on, particularly if there are head of state immunity issues with respect to President Putin himself. But who are the key generals? Who are the key architects? And if you remember from reading the Nuremberg proceedings, some of the Nuremberg defendants were acquitted on the aggression counts because it was determined they just were not in the inner circle that was designing and implementing, at that point, Nazi acts of aggression. And so likewise, who are the key actors? And so that's what this interim prosecutor office could be doing while the international community explores the sort of pros and cons of the different models that are out there, and eventually whatever they end up landing on, everything could be sort of handed over, and potentially this IPO could be folded into that new institution, similar to what was done at the Special Tribunal for Lebanon.
Speaking of immunity, some of those behind efforts to create a new tribunal probably have in mind that leaders like Putin might not have immunity before such a tribunal. What can you say about the U.S. position regarding this?
Yeah, so it's very clear that the so-called troika, head of state, head of government, foreign minister, enjoy immunity before domestic courts. So, and Ukraine, the prosecutor general said this yesterday. I mean, that's a settled question. The open question, I think, is to what extent an international tribunal could overcome those immunities. And of course, we see Article 27 within the ICC statute, which seems to abrogate any sort of head of state immunity or other immunities that might be enjoyed by individuals who might find themselves before the ICC. So it's very much the case that this question of head of state immunity is in part the tail that's wagging a little bit of the dog of what the forum should look like. And so at some level, it will remain for that institution to determine whether it feels like it's a sufficiently international tribunal whereby it feels like it's not bound by it, or will it say, well, without the consent of Russia, and if it's still a sitting head of state, we're not in a position to exercise jurisdiction. But some key points. One, head of state immunity doesn't attach during any investigative stage, so all of this prep work can be done without invoking it. Two, it's a defense, ultimately, an affirmative defense, that a defendant would have to raise. And so much could happen between now and when some member of a troika might be sitting in front of some tribunal somewhere that would take that out of their hands, because ultimately it's owned by the state itself. It's not owned by the individual necessarily. And so there's many, many steps between now and the point when this defense will be raised. So much work can be done in the interim.
I am going to open this up in a minute, but I do want to ask a question. Just how do you organize your office, right? You have all these great people working in your office. How does that work?
Yeah, so we have a great team. We're about 20 persons now. Some of them are detailees and fellows and this and that, and some of them are sort of permanent civil servant employees. We also have 2 foreign service officers who are an incredible resource. I mean, some of our foreign service officers are just amazing. They're generalists, so they don't necessarily come in with maybe any knowledge at all of international criminal law, but they're also so used to being quick studies that they're like sponges. They can just learn it. And I feel like as a former law professor, I feel like I should be handing out JDs to all of our FSOs, because by the time they finish their tour of duty with us, they know just as much about international criminal law as the lawyers on my staff. Most of them are lawyers because our issues are very technical. Everybody has a regional or a country portfolios usually, and a couple of functional portfolios. So, as I mentioned, regionally we cover the globe. So we have a Latin America, we have an Asia team, we have a Near East, Middle East team, Africa team, Europe team, and then we have a couple of functional areas that we're very heavily invested in. So the ICC is sort of one of them, and information sharing with investigative mechanisms more broadly. I've taken on witness protection as a key initiative of the office. Witnesses are very much the soft underbelly of the system. We've seen many, many systems corroded by witness intimidation and witness protection issues. And I want to focus not only on sort of vulnerable percipient survivor witnesses, but also those insider witnesses whose testimony can be so critical for bringing senior figures to justice. And for whatever reason, these people have decided to come forward, whether it's their conscience motivating them or they're just trying to save their ass. But one way or the other, they've decided to come forward. And we need to protect those people and enable them to testify and make sure they're not retaliated against if they choose to do so. And so we've seen increasingly the role of insider witnesses. And we know there were 2 individuals who defected from the Tatmadaw who are now somewhere in a witness protection program, somewhere in Europe, cooperating with the International Criminal Court. So that's a really tough issue. So everybody has a combination of this regional country portfolio, and sometimes it's very odd. I mean, we have one person who covers the Sudans and Bosnia, and it's just by virtue of sort of something opened up, someone left the office, oh, that's an interesting area, I'll take it on. And so then they suddenly become an expert on Bosnia. But we meet as a team once a week at a minimum, and then we have team meetings that happen at regional levels, and then we have lots of sort of informal gatherings that happen. One of the things I love about the job is every day is different. There's no typical day, so it's like impossible to answer a question like, what is your typical day like? And things change constantly throughout the day. So I get there, I get handed my schedule, I know what I'm meant to do, and inevitably a third of it has changed by the time the day is over and something has happened and there's been an important meeting or a development has happened or we need to have a stand-up meeting very quickly to deal with an emerging or evolving situation. And so every day you leave at the end of the day and you think like, wow, I can't believe that all was just an 8-hour day.
Well, I have so many more questions I could ask, but I want to stop there because I want to give those of you in this room a chance to pose questions to the ambassador. And yes, Professor Murphy.
Yeah,
So
Sean?
thanks for coming, Ambassador. The General Assembly decided last fall that it would have a resumed session of the Sixth Committee, the Legal Committee, for 1 week in April to discuss the possibility of transforming draft articles on crimes against humanity developed by the International Law Commission into a convention. So I'm curious what you can say about the U.S. government's likely approach to that resumed session in April, and anything else you can say on the topic.
Yeah, thank you. Well, of course, it's a huge honor to be here with Layla, who first conceptualized this project, and you, who were the special rapporteur in the ILC and who brought it to the point where it's at. We were part of the consensus that was looking really hard at the sort of UN parliamentary rules that would get your draft articles into a forum in which one could conceptualize in creating an actual treaty. And I was really pleased that we were a part of that. And so we'll be a very active, we as the USG and my office will be very active participants in that resumed session and then the next one that's being contemplated. As everybody knows, it's really hard for the US to ratify treaties. I mean, even treaties that are virtually entirely consistent with US law, like the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities or the Convention on the Rights of the Child, where we've come like so close to ratifying and just have not been able to garner the kind of supermajority necessary, or treaties that will completely redound to our benefit from a national security perspective, like the Law of the Sea Treaty. Like we just can't, there's this sort of just enough of a kind of anti-multilateralism that scares off certain members of the Senate that would need to go along with that. So will we ever join the treaty? I don't know, but I think there's a sense that it would be good to have such a treaty for all sorts of reasons. One, it's a concept that finds expression in other parts of US law, but there is no definition. People like Senator Durbin have been trying for more than a decade to draft a crimes against humanity statute, and the lack of a kind of consensus international definition that's out there has kind of hindered that. So we've been trying to put together definitions that will work under US law, but it would be nice to have an off-the-shelf definition to kind of work with. I think for a lot of survivor groups, I think they often feel like it's genocide or nothing. And so if they don't fit the technical definition of genocide, which we know requires membership in a protected group that's specifically listed, and then the very high intent to destroy that group in whole or in part. Sometimes it's difficult to see that, and when someone says, oh, but crimes against humanity are happening there, it doesn't have any meaning to them. And I think in part because there isn't a treaty that enjoys broad-based ratification. So having that treaty, I think, will be useful. It's also quite inspired because it contains within it some mutual legal assistance provisions as well that I think could be used and adopted in other contexts. And so that's always helpful, right, when there's greater cooperation and mechanisms to facilitate that cooperation. So for various reasons, I think we think it's a great idea, but please, nobody hold their breath on ratification because it may take a minute to get that done.
Other questions? Yes, please. And there are mics coming around. Yeah.
I'm Joel. I'm the co-founder of the Uyghur Human Rights Initiative
Oh,
here
great.
at the law school. And my question is on that subject of can you tell us a little bit about what your office is doing to advance justice for Uyghurs and other minorities in the PRC? And can you talk a little bit about a related question of what your office is doing and what can be done for Uyghurs and other Chinese minorities around the world who are facing extradition or persecution?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you for what you're doing. It's incredible that you're bringing attention and building student interest and energy around this because it's another one of the really, really, really tough cases. The USG has been, and I mean that broadly, has been pretty engaged on this. China's a tough case, right? We're so intermeshed with them economically, et cetera. And there isn't a ready court or even courts necessarily with jurisdiction over events that are happening. And Uyghurs, the survivors are not getting out. And so there aren't complainants necessarily that can be of assistance here. So it really is a tough case. So supporting documentation is huge. The humanitarian issue is huge. I was just up in Canada, and as you probably know, Canada just announced that they're going to take 10,000 Uyghurs and bring them there, in part to protect against this transnational repression that we're seeing around the globe, where Uyghurs who are speaking up and other dissidents, other Muslim, minorities, Turkic minorities, et cetera, who are speaking up are being targeted around the world. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is a game changer. So this creates a rebuttable, but a presumption that goods produced in Xinjiang are inherently infected by forced labor. And the importer must prove that they are not in order to be able to get importation. And so now the key is, can we get the Europeans on board with something similar to be able to close off Western wealthy markets to goods that are being produced with forced labor? And so getting that implemented and unfolding the regulations, et cetera, that are going to be making that statute as strong as it should be is the current challenge. Sanctions is another tool that we do have, continuing to sanction individuals and entities that are associated with abuses in Xinjiang, and then the humanitarian issue. Even without access to Xinjiang, it is remarkable what can be done on the documentation front. And we did finally get out of the outgoing High Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, a very strong report that acknowledged crimes against humanity. That's where this term is so important. Her investigation wasn't able to find genocide, but nothing in that precluded that. The US government has come out with a bipartisan consensus. It happened under the Trump administration, but was echoed under the Biden administration, that what is happening there is, in our estimation, an ongoing genocide. But that, what is the follow-up now with that High Commissioner's report? China was quite adept at organizing votes against the most simple of resolutions that would have said, let's continue the conversation about this report, and they shut that down. And so now the question is, what can we do in the March session to reopen the fact that that needs to remain on the Human Rights Council's agenda, and that the Human Rights Council will have zero credibility if it's not keeping that issue on the agenda.
John.
Thanks for being with us, Beth. Actually, I want to follow up on that, your last words on the determination of genocide. Yeah. So Secretary Pompeo, in his last minutes in office, issued a determination that the U.S. government had concluded that China was committing genocide against the Uyghurs. It was reported in the press, I don't know whether this is true or not, that he overruled the legal recommendation of the legal advisor's office, who said that they were not convinced that the standard, not that they disagreed as a policy matter, but just that they had not found that there was intent. That's always the difficulty, as you know. Secretary Blinken, or Secretary Designate Blinken, was asked about that in his confirmation hearing. He said, I agree that genocide's being committed. But of course, he hadn't seen any of the evidence at that point. It's very, very difficult. Todd and Adam have written a very good report on determinations of genocide. So it's been 2 years since that determination by Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Blinken's statement that he agreed, but makes it very difficult for the U.S. to follow up with other countries unless we can actually show what we've found. And so I assume your office has the policy lead on that. Is there going to be a laying out of the facts and the law on the genocide being committed by China?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, historically, of course, we don't do that, in part because so often these determinations are based upon classified information. And so if it's not easily done to declassify that information, it's hard not to say. We do try and say as much as we can, what are the particular elements that we're looking at, et cetera, which actors are most responsible. We do try and reveal as much of that as we can. We can also, and maybe this is more important than making a public sort of revelation of this, we can also share with accountability and investigatory mechanisms, such as commissions of inquiry. We can enter into arrangements with them where that can be shared with them so that it can inform their own thinking about these issues. So to me, that's the important piece of it. But your point is a good one, that genocide is difficult, but we should always remember that there's 5 different ways that genocide can be committed, and only one of them is mass killing. And that tends to be where people's colloquial understanding stops at the concept. But looking at with greater granularity on conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of the group, serious bodily or mental harm, in the Xinjiang situation, the prevention of births, and seeing some of that really kind of troubling demographic data. And recognizing that there can be such a thing as slow death. And that was, I think, an innovative concept produced by the ICTY, looking at some of the conditions of life situations, and the Rwanda Tribunal thinking about, even if people are surviving a campaign of terror, they're not thriving and their communities are not thriving, and ultimately it will lead to the destruction of the group. And so I think we have to take the terms of the Genocide Convention on their face and apply all of those different provisions when we're doing this.
So I'd like to just jump in really quickly and follow up in a slightly different direction on the Uyghur situation, which is, you mentioned the sanctions regime and other mechanisms to try to impact business with the region, since we don't have international tribunals with jurisdiction, right? That's a very potentially impactful way to deal with the situation. This indicates the importance of the role of the private sector.
Yes.
So first, with respect to China and the Uyghurs specifically, are you engaging the private sector directly at first? Because the private sector has been acting independently of sanctions on this issue to some degree. And then second, just beyond this particular context, but globally, right, a lot of the information about atrocities is coming up through lots of data that's being generated through social media, through the traces in our daily lives that are being picked up, and in often cases held by private companies. And you've written about this, right? So more broadly, what are the challenges and opportunities here with respect to the private sector?
Yeah, it's a great and actually quite timely question. The McCain Institute just hosted an event that a couple people here attended that was focused very much on this public-private partnership, bringing together some of the tech leaders. The focus was Ukraine, and it was very much around the presence of the Prosecutor General here in the United States. But I think the kind of conversations we were having can apply more broadly to other elements of the private sector. We are in a world now where there is so much evidence able to be generated in the digital realm about the commission of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. So the problem is now almost the flip. There's too much information, and how do we sift through it all and identify that best evidence that then will be able to be used? And can we get to a point, and this was one of the conversations we had at the McCain Institute, where this digital information is essentially self-authenticating. So you don't anymore need the witness who will say, I took my cell phone and I held it at this angle and I recorded this event and then I uploaded it. Can all of that be happening essentially simultaneously through tech mechanisms, locking down the metadata, ensuring that it can't be tampered with? We call it hashing, essentially creating a digital fingerprint for a digital artifact of a atrocity situation, and then getting it into the hands of prosecutors who can then use that information. So that is the current challenge. Because Ukraine is already very sophisticated technologically, they're sort of leapfrogging ahead in many respects of this. So this will be the test case, I think, and this was another theme that came out at the McCain event, which was this idea of we're remaking the field in a way, and not just the field generally, but of evidence, what qualifies as evidence. So I think that's incredibly important, but it's not just high tech, and I think this is where Xinjiang, I'll circle back to the beginning of your question. It's really important to think about just old school manufacturing and making sure that goods that are coming into our markets are not either fueling or taking advantage of human rights abuses in labor markets abroad. And those goods should not be undercutting US goods that are being produced under fair labor standards. And so it seems we should be able to get the private industry on board for this, because we know that Chinese companies are able to undercut companies elsewhere all across the board because they've got thousands and thousands of Uyghurs in detention who are working around the clock under horrible conditions to create goods that we're probably all wearing today here and growing the tomatoes that we are all eating in our lunches, et cetera. And so we need to get at those enablers, I think, of atrocities, just as we do the direct perpetrators. And we just had a very interesting bilat, if you want to call it, between our office and the Commerce Department, because I wanted to better understand what tools Commerce has. We think about Treasury and sanctions and all that, and we have a sanctions person in our office who's our sanctions person, and we have a coordinator in the State Department that's sort of looking at the 15,000 foot, but I didn't really understand what tools Commerce had, and so that was a great education for me.
That's really interesting. Yeah, question.
Thank you. So on the topic of genocide, you've mentioned there's different forms. A growing topic in interdisciplinary study is ecocide, and I just wanted to know how your office is now handling, not only this new area, but also the rise in climate refugees growing around the world.
Yeah, this is a failing of our office. We just have not been able to have the bandwidth or the internal expertise to really dive into that area. And so that as a result, the situation is way ahead of, I think, our own thinking about this. It's on our list for sure, and we've started to talk about it. But I think we all have to acknowledge that the climate insecurity and the changes that are being wrought, coupled with food insecurity and everything, is going to start to create situations where just competition between groups could very easily devolve into terrible atrocity situations. And we need to be ready for that. So that's one angle of the sort of environmental law. Your point about ecocide is another angle, which is to what extent are attacks that create long-term harm, deliberate harm to the environment, to what extent are those actionable under maybe existing accountability mechanisms or concepts, or do we need a new concept of ecocide? And there is this initiative, which I imagine you're probably following, to add ecocide as a sort of a fifth crime within the ICC statute. Others have argued that a better approach would be to create a standalone tribunal like Layla has argued to be done as for crimes against humanity, rather than going for an amendment before the ICC. And I think there are good arguments on both sides of that, but there's no question at all that we need to be focused on this, both from the prevention side, but also we have to be ready for when this happens, and that when environmental issues, of course they already have been, but become more and more salient in terms of driving conflict and driving harm around the world.
Yes. You're.
Thank you. So we've talked a little bit about Ukraine, and recently it was announced that the Wagner Group will be considered as a transnational criminal organization, which is interesting in light of their connection with the Russian state. Yeah. So where they are acting in places outside of Ukraine, are there efforts underway as a result of that designation to gather evidence of things they are doing, and what does it mean to treat them as a group that's separate from the state in terms of state responsibility versus criminal acts?
So yes, is the answer to your first question. Wagner is a malign force everywhere in which they are found. So even when I was in Bangui in the Central African Republic, you see them driving around in these technicals. They're all wearing balaclavas. I'm like, really? You're in Central African Republic, it's like 900 degrees and you're wearing a balaclava? Like, it's just amazing to see. And the allegations against them are legion wherever they are. And yet, for many of these countries, I think they see them as the only option, because if there is a UN peacekeeping mission, and in many cases where Wagner is operating, there is not, it's maybe not as strong as it needs to be. The international community isn't as focused on providing security assistance. Regimes, administrations feel under threat, and they see Wagner as a source of protection, and there's no other alternatives, and so they gravitate towards that. But as we know, it's a poison chalice, right? Because once Wagner is in, they don't leave. And they're enriching themselves through natural resources, et cetera. So it's a terrible situation. The designation, a lot can be done, but it does open, without a designation, but it does open a lot of doors and create certain authorities that are available and that can be deployed more quickly. And so that's going to be the key, I think. I don't think, and I should look at this closely, and your point is raising to me, and there's lawyers in the office who hopefully will go back and school me on this after this meeting, but I don't think it precludes a finding that Russia is ultimately responsible for what Wagner is doing. Wagner is itself doing bad things, but it's also being deployed by Russia, and it's very much a proxy. I think probably in some cases it is acting more independently than maybe Russian policy would be, or Russia's just not, they're just not paying any attention to what it's doing. It's not like they're, working against Russia necessarily. It's certainly a tip of the spear, I think, for Russia to get influence into other areas. But I don't think the designation would preclude a finding of state responsibility. But I'll look into that because it's a very astute question.
Yes, and Wagner's support is not just around the world, but it's growing in Russia as well.
Yes.
But of course, the standard for state responsibility and drawing that connection it's a difficult one to meet. It's something I'm writing about right now.
Excellent. We'll look forward to that.
But on that note, I'd like to give you the last word,
Yeah.
Beth, before we wrap up. And I think what we've seen here is it's just an extraordinary moment for global criminal justice in terms of what you're doing and what's possible right now.
Yeah, well, I guess mostly just to thank everyone for your interest and everything that you're doing with respect to groups that are really under siege around the world. This really is a kind of an all-hands-on-deck moment, I think, not just the situation in Ukraine, but just the state of the planet generally. But at the same time, we have so many creative ideas and institutions that exist, and so we need to use them and to strengthen them. And there's places for individuals, including young people, young emerging lawyers, to plug in at multiple places. Whether you go to a law firm in which, I've spoken to a young man who was working on this case being brought in Germany involving the Rohingya violations and post-coup violations. So a very broad factual matrix there that, let's hope the German prosecutors take up. Private sector and pro bono working for local criminal offices where you can bring trafficking cases and utilize the new authorities that Congress has given us around the war crime statute in Title 18 to, working in the public sector or with the civil society sector. So there's lots of different ways to plug in. And so I would just urge people to find what your contribution is and to lean into that.
Well, please join me in thanking Ambassador von Schaack for sharing just her incredible leadership and expertise in this area.
Thank you.